Hey, Granny Gear here for Old Guy in a Bike. You know, lately, I've been thinking about gearing. I've been thinking about gearing for my gravel bike and my road bike as well. And today, well, I'm going to think out loud a little bit on this Tech Tuesday. Gearing. I think other than what tire I should run and of course maybe what bike I should buy, what gears I should run, well, that's a hot topic, isn't it? And I think it's become even more hot because of gravel bikes. You know, on a mountain bike, I mean, 2x for mountain bikes are just completely dead. If it's any kind of a trail bike at all, you're running a big cassette in the back, 11 speed or 12 speed, probably 12 speed like a 1052 or a 1051 if you're a Shimano guy, and you've got a 30 to a 32 front chainring. That would be the huge percentage of mountain bikes out there. Then on the road, well, if you're Shimano, more than likely you're running a 5034 with 1132 or maybe 1134, or whatever the new 12-speed combos are for Shimano. You could have a 5236 front chainring. And if you're a bad mamma jamma or you're a pro, your chain rings in the front are even bigger and bigger. If you're running SRAM 2x, well now, oh my goodness, we have all kinds of choices, don't we? And briefly, I'm going to talk about that today because that, I think, is really, really smart gearing for the masses in 2x. I think that's what SRAM is doing. But today I want to talk about some general principles more than specifics. I want to talk about mostly on 1x that I am going to be applying to myself. Now, I'll be giving you the results later. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail yet. I want to talk in general terms. I want to experience it myself before I sit up here and tell you how wonderful it is. But let's talk a little bit about this big old cassette and why you don't want to ruin it because your front chainring is the wrong size. This is a SRAM XO Eagle mountain bike cassette. Now it's what I have on the Turner Cyclosis behind me because I'm running a Mullet setup. I have a 40 tooth front chainring, and this is a, of course, 1052 cassette, 12 speed. And that combination so far has been, well, it's been pretty adequate. A 40-52 certainly is a very low gear. That's a 12 tooth jump. I haven't needed anything lower than that yet, and we ride some pretty difficult, long, rough, steep dirt roads here in Southern California. And a 40-10, well, that's certainly a tall enough gear. I mean, over 30 miles an hour, I'm probably spinning like a crazy hamster, but I don't really need to do that very often on my gravel bike. Honestly, if I'm going that fast, probably coasting downhill. So the Mullet setup has not been perfect, but on the other hand, it's given me all the gears I want, except something is happening that I'm not too crazy about. And it goes to this thought: where does your chain live on your 1x cassette? By that I mean, when you're riding on your typical rides, and if you were to pay attention to where your chain is living most of the time you're riding, not in every situation, of course, because you're going to be hills and flat, but most of the time, where is it? Are you up here at the top of the cassette? A lot. Are you in the 52? A lot. Are you down in the 10 and the 12? A lot. If you are, then you might consider changing your front chainring. Because unlike 2x, you only got one chainring to make it work for everything, which is of course one of the drawbacks of 1x. However, you need to also think about where you're living on this cassette. Now, why don't you want to spend a lot of time in this top cog? After all, that's why it's there. It's big, it's handy, it's deep, it gets you up these little bitty hills. Well, I'll tell you what, a couple good reasons. You know this is made of aluminum, don't you? At least on this cassette. I don't know about the less expensive ones, GX and below. Those might be steel, but for weight savings, this is an aluminum chainring. Now, you know, this is the size of a Shimano front chainring for a road compact crank. Isn't that crazy? 50 teeth. But just because it's big and light doesn't mean you can't wear it out, and you can. And you're going to wear it out if you spend an inordinate amount of time up in it, whether you're climbing or whatever you're doing, because the combination of this being aluminum and your chain line coming from your chain ring going way over to get over to here and run on that, that's going to wear things out much faster than you'd really like. And this is an expensive cassette. I think I already mentioned that. You don't want to be buying a new cassette just because this top gear is worn out when all the rest of them are just fine. So pay attention. And I've been paying attention. I've been watching to where I live on the cassette. And you know what I found out is I'm spending too much time in the 52. Now, it's not necessarily because I need to be there, but here's the problem with this Eagle cassette. This is a 42, the next cog down, that's a 42 tooth. This is a 52 tooth. 10 teeth is a really, really big jump. And what I find is sometimes the 40-42, that's really not that low a gear, is just not enough. You know, I'm making it, but I'm working too hard, and I know I've got another hour of climbing, and I don't want to work that hard. Then I jump to the 52, well, I'm spinning really faster. What I need is something in the middle. Well, SRAM doesn't really offer that unless I want to spend an awful lot of money for the T-type transmission system that, is a whole ecosystem on its own, chain and everything's unique. They actually changed the gap. I think this cog is a 44, if I have my numbers right. If that was a 44, I probably wouldn't need to shift out of it as much. I could probably stay in that gear, live there and make my climb, and only occasionally go into 52 for short, bursty, steep parts. But I wouldn't be burning out the 52 just because that gear isn't quite low enough. Well, what do? I can't magically invent a cassette, can I, from SRAM that doesn't exist? Well, I'll tell you what I can do. I can evaluate how I'm using this in general, and I think to myself, well, you know what, if I had a smaller chain ring, that would be almost like making these gears different, wouldn't it? Let's say I go from a 40-tooth chain ring to a 38-tooth chain ring, all right? When I do that, I magically make not just this gear lower, right? So now a 38-52, that's a 14-tooth gap. That's a lot. Not only does this gear get lower, every single gear on the cassette gets lower. That means that now, instead of running a 40-42, I've got a 38-42, which is pretty much the same as taking this second cog, making it a 44. All right, take a break. Noisy helicopter. So I can reduce my chain ring size and effectively tweak the overall ratio within my cassette as far as my pedals are concerned. However, is there a downside to that? Well, yeah, there is, because now all of a sudden I don't have as big a top gear. So now if every gear on this cassette is lower because my chain ring's smaller, that means maybe my 12 tooth, which is the next one up from 10, well, maybe now that isn't quite high enough for the road, and I'll be in my 10 tooth more than I used to be. Is that, pick your poison. And of course, that's one of the problems with one by is you've just got that one chain ring to live with. But if I, typical ride, am really not down in the bottom two cogs of my cassette that often, well then going to from a 40 to a 38, probably I won't even notice. But I will notice the difference in the low gears, and right now that's what I'm focusing on. So I've got some plans. I've got some plans that involve some different chainring sizes and also a cassette that really could be the game changer I was looking for, but more on that later. I don't want to recommend something I haven't tried. But here's the general principle to sum up the one by part before I go on too long. Pay attention to where your chain is living on your cassette while you're riding. Now, if you have, I think it's the hammerhead, that SRAM bought, the Karoo by Karoo or whatever, I don't know if it's still Karoo, the Karoo 2 or whatever that is. It will interface with your, and you have access electronic shifting. If you have that, it'll track the gears you use throughout your ride, which is a really, really kind of neat tool. That's a little geeky, I know, but it'll actually tell you on your rides what cog you're living in most of the time. And if you're like shifted up to the top of your cassette, well then you need a smaller chain ring. If you're living down at the bottom, maybe you need a bigger chain ring. If you're right in the fat middle, well maybe it's just about perfect. Anyway, something to consider if you have that technology. But if not, what can you do? Well, just look back there once in a while and just kind of pay attention to where you are and adjust. But you don't want to be burning out that top aluminum cog on the very, very expensive cassette. Not to mention the relative inefficiency of that sharp chain line when you're really, really crossed over on one by. You don't want to run at either extreme very often. In fact, here's some sage advice that I heard on a ride by someone, I don't know who they were, but it was very smart. He said, you know you've got the right chain ring up front on your one by when you're almost never in either end of your cassette for very long. That sums it all up very, very well. Well, what about 2x? Say you got 2 chain rings on your crank, not just one. Well, how do we look at that? Well, it's a little bit different. For one thing, chain line, since you have 2 chain rings, well, that moves over one way or the other, depending upon what chain ring you are on. And so your chain line isn't as acute on the cassette. And as well, most road cassettes, unless you spend a lot of money for red or Dura-Ace, they're all steel. And so you don't have an aluminum cog typically to wear out ahead of the time and burn out that expensive cassette. So there isn't that consideration. Chain line isn't as severe, and you don't have that big old aluminum pie plate to wear out like you do on an Eagle cassette. But there are some things to think about. Now, this is a SRAM crank. This came off my Time 80HX. And I think SRAM, it's what I've been running now for quite a while on my bikes, and recently the Access stuff. And I am a fan, and I'll tell you why. There's 2 reasons. The gearing choices, I think, make more sense for most riders. And that is because you can get reduced chainring sizes. Now, this is a 48-35. If you have a Shimano crank, and I'm not saying that's a terrible thing. They work really well for just about everybody, really, but you're limited. You've got, unless you want to go for the pro rings, you've got a 52-36 or a 50-34. 50-34 is what you're going to see sold on most bikes if it's Shimano, 11 or 12 speed. This is a 48-35. They also offer a 46-33, and under the wide access wide stuff, a 43-30, which is more useful for gravel bikes, but doesn't mean you can't put it on a road bike. That's a lot of choices, and that choice, I think, makes sense for a lot of people who are riding road bikes. I would say that most people, when you're talking about a typical compact road crank like Shimano with a 50-tooth crank, big chainring, and an 11-tooth rear cog, spinning out a 50-11, probably not doing that. That takes a little bit of doing, and if you are in it for very long, you're probably not putting out the kind of power to actually spin that down the road and spin out for any length of time at all, other than maybe on a fast downhill. So what you can end up with is you end up in your small chain ring a lot, because a 50-tooth is kind of big, and so you end up either living in the upper part of your cassette if you're in the big ring, which you don't really want to do, or because you don't want to do that, you shift into the small chain ring. Now you're in a smaller chain ring than you really need to be, and it kind of gets back to that 1x thing, is where is your chain living in relation to your gears? And if you look down in the big chain ring and you're hardly ever down in the bottom of your cassette, maybe your chain rings are too big. But SRAM gives you options. This is a 48-35. Like I said, 46-33 is what I just put on my Time 80HX, and we'll talk about that when I get into some other videos. I wanted overall lower gearing for a very, very difficult ride coming up. But will that work for me long term? I don't know. I'll be talking about that as I experience it. That has yet to come. However, back to this. So SRAM gives you reduced chainring sizes. I like to stay in the big ring. I'm a bit of a diesel. With a smaller front chainring, I can stay in the big ring longer, and I don't have to be as far up in the cassette in order to stay there, right? And I like that. That works well for me. The small chainring of a 35 with a 10-36 rear cassette, that's low enough. I've got a pretty low gear except for this ride that's coming up, but generally speaking, 35-36 is decently low gear for me. Another thing I like about the SRAM crank and 2x is the difference in tooth count between the small chainring and the big chainring is only 13 teeth, where in Shimano it's bigger, it's 16. 13 teeth to 16 teeth, you don't understand maybe the difference till you shift it. When you shift into a 50 down to a 34, that's a big cadence change. You can feel it. Now you get used to that, and after a while you just see is what it is. But once you experience this and you shift from the big ring to the small ring, or the small ring to the big ring, it's only a 13 tooth jump. It's much less of a cadence change, and I really like that. Anyway, just something I've gotten used to. So 2x isn't quite the same as 1x in that, you know, your cassette is a little different and the chain line shifts over, so that's a little different, but you still maybe need to pay attention to how you're using your gears efficiently, and it's entirely possible that your big chain ring might be too big, and you may not even think about that. All right, that's it for now. Tech Tuesday is drawing to a close. Thanks for hanging out on my front porch as I ramble about gears and little spinning metal things. I'll be reporting back. Mostly, my main interest is on this 1x changes I'm doing, because I think that's the most significant change. But I'll be talking about the 2x swap I did, where I did that crank swap, because I think it's interesting to see, you know, really how small of a big chain ring can I live with and still be happy? And within the SRAM world, I have a little bit of flexibility there. It may be a bridge too far. I'll find out. I will let you know when I know. In the meantime, have a great week and or weekend. And as always, you guys go ride your bikes. Hey, just for fun, here's a little experiment. I just kind of did it by accident. See if your wheel does this. Now watch. This is my Time 80 HX with the Rolf Prima wheels on them. Those amazing hubs that are based on White Industry stuff. So what I'm doing is taking the valve stem, I'm standing it up at 12 o'clock. I'm just going to let the wheel go. Let's see what happens. That is a free rolling hub, at least in the work stand anyway. If it rolls that well with my weight on it, that looks like a win to me. Anyway, try that with your wheel. Let me know what happens.